Get a songbook and turn to page 660. 660. I will serve thee because I love thee. You have given life to me. I was nothing before you found me. You have given life to me. Heartaches, broken pieces, ruined lives are why you died on Calvary. Your touch was what I long for. You have given life to me. Brother Clark, would you open with the word of prayer?
Lord, we thank you this evening for the fact that you have given us life, and you came to give us life and life abundantly. And that we can
Amen. Well, it's good to see everybody tonight. Good to see the winter didn't take you out. This bitter cold. I bet none of us remembered to thank the Lord for good weather this week, but we should have, because it's been nice. And I'm sure it'll turn off a little colder maybe next week, but next week I have to be gone. And we'll be doing some little things a little bit different in here. But next week, it's kind of a strange thing. My wife is telling me now that we may not even qualify. We got, just to give you a story. You don't need a story, but I'll tell it to you anyhow. We had a missionary, Brother Booth, coming in, been a couple months ago, and I tried to always go to Holiday Inn and book the room for him, but this day I didn't have time to go over there, so I called. Well, that doesn't work, because you don't get them. You get someplace in another world, and they get it wrong. They always get it wrong. And even the people over there told me I had to go by later and check, and it was wrong. They got it wrong. In fact, we're listed under Brian McBride at the motel. I don't know how that is, but they said, well, yeah, is not he that runs, pastors the church? I said, well, he's here once a year, but we don't really call that pastoring. But somehow in that 45-minute conversation of trying to get a room for him, they got me through all these different places. I was talking to people in Florida, and they don't speak English. You can't hardly understand them. And I finally figured out what they was doing. They're trying to sell me a timeshare. But I usually with those things comes, if you've ever done it, you go, they say, you're going to get this if you listen to the spiel. I can listen to people's spiel. And so I figured out that for $200, I get to stay for 4 days and 3 nights in Florida and listen for 2 hours to their spiel, and the rest of the time's mine. And then they hand me the $200 back once I've listened to their, so I said, okay, we'll do it. Now, Karen wasn't so excited when she found that out, but I told her, I said, all we got to do is listen to him for 2 hours. The first time we ever did it was when Brad was a baby. And it worked real well because he started really getting fussy and crying and everything. He couldn't walk, and I just flopped him there on the floor, and he'd cry a little more. And then people, they was getting impatient with it, and they tried their best, but they never got us sold on it. So now today we got some things. She said that we have to qualify. You have to make so much money. She said, I don't think we make that much money. I said, well, she said, they said there'll be a $500 penalty. I said, there's not going to be any penalty. I said, they're going to hand me $200 when I get out of there, and there's not going to be any penalty. I can tell you that. So I don't know how it's going to work, but anyhow, I won't be here next week because I'll be out taking advantage of the people that's trying to take advantage of me. But we have a new prayer list, I believe. And I don't know if everybody got one. I think Brother Rich was handing them out back there. We are looking, I want to remind you, this Sunday is our Vision Sunday, so we've got some new things coming up. We'll have everybody will be in here Sunday morning, adults for Sunday school. We won't be breaking out into the classes. And then the following week, we'll be starting all kinds of different, we're just trying a few things different. And so even Wednesday night will be a little bit different. We're trying to work ways of updating our list here a little bit easier. I don't know, we haven't quite figured out how we're going to do that, but we'll get some things figured out. But if you got a new list, here's some things that was, Diane is in Florida already, Diane Holzapple, but she's still, we're in contact, and she sent me some folks to pray for today. Cole Sutherland, that's her sister's grandson, has been in the hospital on a, I think she said he had to go on a ventilator. Let me look it back up now. But I don't know how old he is. But anyhow, she asked that we pray for him, so I'm going to look that back up and see if. Yeah, I guess he is with the ventilator. He's been having breathing problems. That's Cole Sutherland. And then Katrina Craddock. She's going to be having heart surgery on February the 3rd to replace a valve. So if you'd put them on there. And pray for them if you would. I was supposed to put my cousin's wife. Her name is Pat Minks. Put her on the sick list. He calls her Tricia, but it's Patricia. Pat Minks. She is struggling with dementia right now, Alzheimer's, whichever, and also she's having heart trouble. So. Now what's going on out here we can talk about? Yes, ma'am? Okay. Trish Jones. You say that's Bryce's wife? Okay. Yes, ma'am? Okay, so I got Jennifer Rio, Kathy Lowe, and Jenny, and I don't know what you said. That shouldn't be legal.
I know, right? It took me 20 years to be able to say it.
Yes, sir.
My sister went back to the place for a biopsy Monday for cancer. She called me today and said it was found negative.
Okay, that's good. Dottie Trans there at the very bottom, so we won't take her off yet. We'll keep praying, but that's a good report. Yes, sir. For your eyes? Okay. Okay. Yeah, we got you through your hip, and I thought well, I'm looking around here. I think we still got you on here. But we got so many people on here. I'm I'm losing where everybody's at now. But we'll be praying. We'll pray for your eyes. I seen another hand somewhere right over here. Yes, ma'am.
We still have my granddaughter Natalie listed here under mothers and babies. She did have the baby 2 weeks ago. Baby was born at 8'8". She's down to 7'4". They're gonna do something with her mouth to make sure that she's still losing instead of gaining at this
Yeah.
point. But in addition to that, Natalie's having some complications, and she's going back to the hospital tomorrow morning for a procedure. So if you just keep her in your prayers that all that goes well, I would appreciate it.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Linda is on the sick list. She's much better. She's home. So
Okay, I'm looking now. She was at the bottom of the sick list about sometime. Oh, she's way over there on the second. I never found her this time. Anything else going on? Stories you need to tell? When I'm preaching on Sunday, can you hear this microphone making these noises like this? On Wednesday, it's like it's creeping up and down on me.
There's a bigger crowd.
That's it. We need more people. We had plenty of people Sunday. I'll say that. That was a great Sunday. I talked to Mary Jervis in Florida. Oh, I know what I was going to tell you. The Bensons. Some of you remember the Bensons. Thelma passed away a few months back, and Bob passed away this. I talked to him. He said I'll be up in the spring. He said I'm probably going to stay in assisted living. And his son said he said his dad he misses mom too much. Said I don't think he's going to make it till spring, and he didn't. But he was ready to go. I think he was 86, 87, something like that. But so the Bensons they're back together in heaven. They've left us all here. But that maybe I was talking to Mary Jervis in Florida. Now I forgot where I was going with that story. See, I do that. I get too many stories going. But she didn't believe me. She just asked me how church is going. I said great. And I said this Sunday we baptized 4 people, and I said we wasn't expecting so many visitors, and we didn't have enough chairs. And I said we was running to get chairs and stuff. And a little bit later she said, would you tell the truth on that? I said, would I lie? I said, why would you suspect me of telling an untruth? I said, honest face like this. But yeah, she couldn't believe it. I said they told me there was 289 people, and I said, I believe it. I didn't see too many empty seats anywhere. Anything else? Okay, well, we'll come back to this prayer list here at the end of the service. And if you got your Bibles with you tonight, open to the book of 1 Corinthians, chapter number 3. I'm pretty good at starting thoughts and never getting finished. And these guys are helping me now because we're having Vision Sunday this week. And so Brian will be preaching Sunday morning. And I think maybe Brad will be preaching Sunday night. I can't remember how we decided all this, but so I've started some thoughts on Sunday morning, but we'll catch them up later. And I've started some thoughts on Sunday night. We'll catch them up later. And I've started a thought here on Wednesday night, and we'll catch it up later. But the book of 1 Corinthians, I'm going to be in chapter number 3. In fact, I'm just going to go ahead and read some verses starting down in verse number 4. We read the first few verses a couple weeks ago, but Paul's writing here. Needless to say, the Corinthian church would not be the model church. There's a church not too far from here that calls herself the Corinthian Baptist Church. I would never want to do that because there's not a whole lot of good characteristics about Corinth here. But verse 4 said, for while one saith, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are ye not carnal? Who then is Paul? And who is Apollos? But ministers by whom you believed, even as the Lord gave to every man. I have planted. That's Paul writing this. He said, I did some planting, but Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. Now he that planteth and he that watereth are one, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are laborers together with God. You're God's husbandry, you're God's building, according to the grace of God, which is given unto me as a wise master builder. I've laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon, but let every man take heed how he buildeth thereupon. So that's Paul writing and trying to instruct a little bit here to the Corinthians. And really the letter of 1 Corinthians is a letter of correction. He wrote it because there was a lot of problems that existed there in that church. There was division, there was idolatry, there was immorality. And sadly, this was a church that instead of having an influence in the world in which they lived, they were all influenced by the world in which they lived. And they practiced those things. And that's why he called them last week. We looked at the problem of being carnal. And so he gives some specific warnings in these chapters, especially chapter 3 here, about what I call pitfalls to growing spiritually, or progress in our spiritual life. And last time we learned a couple weeks ago that we got to avoid if we're going to grow spiritually, we have to avoid the pitfall of carnality. Just being on our way to heaven, but no sign of it, because we're more like the world than anything else. But today I'm going to see that we also have to avoid another pitfall. I call it of complacency. I want to use the word apathy, but it doesn't go along with carnality, so I'll use complacency. And to make sure I understood complacency, I looked it up, and it was kind of strange. There was a good one-word definition in there: smugness. I kind of like that because it means to be self-satisfied. And that's sort of where the Corinthian church was. They were impressed with themselves. And you know people like this. And I hate to say it, but I've known quite a few people in my time, and several of them were preachers that they just got really satisfied with themselves, and they was good for the world in their mind. And so this church, they had a lot of people, their hearts was filled with pride. And I'm sure when they got this letter from Paul, it had to be a shock. He's talking about us. He would say things like this to us: man, we're the cream of the crop here. Cat's meow, you might even say. And so they were so smug. But spiritual complacency, I think it is a very great pitfall even of today, of a lot of people. Just as carnality, as we mentioned, it hinders us from growing spiritually, and it causes spiritual immaturity. Spiritual complacency in a church, what it hinders is a lot of times is involvement. And besides the fact that it contributes to more immaturity in the church. So a spiritually complacent Christian many times has the attitude, I don't need certain things. For instance, I don't need Sunday school. I mean, I'm glad they come, but Sunday school is for kids, for people that don't know stuff like I know stuff. They don't understand the Bible as good as I do. And so that we get complacent. Now we're still saved, but we got in our mind we don't need something because we've got things figured out. And so we don't need to get involved here. I don't want to get involved here. And I don't really need to grow. I think I've grown. I'm done a good job growing. And that is a very dangerous spot for anybody that's saved to ever get into the word. If you ever get to the place you think, I'm doing all right. Because it's, and I part of it is because I coached and I always told, never feel like you're all right. Always feel like we got to improve. We got to do a little bit, we can do a little more. And so I just see it that way. And so in our text here, we see what we need to apply to our lives so that we don't fall into complacency. Because this church and these people in this church, they got in trouble because they lost sight of some, what I call important principles. So I'm going to mention 4 of them. One of them is we should never lose sight of our place in God's work. If you got your Bibles there with you, look back in chapter 1 and verse number 11. They were talking here in verse number 11 about some division in leadership here in the church. It says, he says, verse 11, for it has been declared unto me of you, my brethren, by them which are of the house of Chloe. So evidently there was somebody in the church that said, this is not good for our church, and we need to get a hold of Paul, get somebody to and so Chloe here wrote a letter to Paul and said, there's contentions among you. Now this I say, that every one of you saith, some said, hey, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, and I'm of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? You see, they had a problem understanding the preachers in God's work, the ministers here. They were taking sides. You know, Paul's it. He's the greatest. There's nobody like him. And we do this. People do it today. I can remember growing up, and I remember if we'd have certain speakers, certain preachers come in, I remember people in our church, well, they're not going to show up because they don't like this guy. He's not as good as the preacher they like. And I'm thinking to myself, if I'm in a church, I'm following the leadership. If my leadership in the church thinks this is a person that we need for this meeting, then we're going to have him, and I'm going to be there. But that's what they were. They said, well, I'm of Paul, and some said I'm of Apollos. And so in verse up in chapter number 3 where we just was, he reminds them that these people, we're not anybody. Paul said, I'm nobody. I'm a minister. I'm just a servant, and so is Apollos. And so he says in verse 4, he said, for while one saith, I am of Paul, another, I am of Apollos, are you not carnal? Who then is Paul, and who is Apollos, but ministers by whom you believed, even as the Lord gave to every man? So he was stressing the fact that we're just everybody people. We're just servants, and God's put in a position, serve tables. We take care of people. But what he was pointing out was we're all doing our part so the work gets done. And a complacent Christian forgets their place in God's work. They forget that they're part of a team. And I think about people that get saved here in our church, or young people. It's easier to think about young people, because young people, they're involved. They got a Sunday school teacher that teaches them. Is that the reason they get saved? That's part of the reason. But then they sit in church. And they got mom and dad that's helping them with things, and they've got examples. They've got different people in the church, and then if they come and talk to somebody, they may talk to someone they've never talked to before about getting saved. So it's all a part of everybody working together to reach them. And but because everybody took their place, people get born into the family of God, and that's what he's saying. He said, "Hey, I planted, but he said people didn't get saved, and Apollos watered. That helped it. It brought it along farther, but." Still, God give the increase, and he's trying to point that out. So, but my thought is we have to be willing to get involved to take our place, because what you do may not seem like it. Maybe your job is just to simply make sure that the parking lot looks nice for people, so they would want to come to a church that is not looking bad. You say, well, that doesn't seem like much. It might not, but it might be the one reason that they didn't drive to another place. They thought this church looks interesting, something like that. It's some little thing like that, but we're doing our part. So we don't never want to fall into the trap of losing sight of being involved. Everything's important. I still say, and I say this all the time, the toughest job and one of the most important jobs in the whole church is the nursery. And so if ever you decide, I want to take the toughest thing there is, put your name on a list somewhere. We'll get you in there as quick as we can. And some of these ladies would be glad to give up a day in there. But never be so smug to think, and I have to use that word because that's what it said when I looked it up, to think, I don't want to get involved. I just want to be a member. And I know people that will go to big churches so they don't have to get involved. If you can find a church that's got 500 or 600 people, there's a real good chance they can slip in and maybe not get involved, people not notice them so much. But if the church is doing as it ought to, you'll figure out that they're in there. So we need to be involved. And it kind of reminds me of my wife's dad. He's sitting back there. Now, he didn't ever tell you this story about his fishing days when he was here. We had to send him off to Texas for a while. And even in Texas, he calls it fishing, but he doesn't fish. When I think of fishing, I think of a person with a pole in their hand, and they throw it out, and when they get a bite, they reel it in. But that's not the way he fishes. When he was in Florida, he would go down, or when he was in Texas, he would go down there, and he would tie a couple fishing poles on the back of his boat and drive out through this big 1,000,000-acre lake. And when he'd come back, he'd look, see if he had anything following him. Well, that's not fishing, but that's what he did. But now, before he left there, he was fishing here in the lakes. And he got pretty good at fishing. In fact, he got catching a lot of fish, and he got the attention of the game warden. And the game warden he started coming to church because, he's a pastor. And so the game warden got into church a little bit, and he got talking to him, and he was curious about how things was going. So he kind of went undercover. He didn't tell him he was a game warden. And he got to know him pretty well until he got invited fishing with him. So they was out one day fishing in the boat, and he noticed that Brother Price didn't even take a fishing pole. Now he's really curious. So they get out there, and after a little bit of chit-chat, He said, well, it's time to fish. He reaches in his jacket, pulls out a stick of dynamite, and tosses it, lights it, and tosses it in. Kaboom! The big boom, and all these fish start floating, and he's scooping them in, and he gets them all scooped in, and the game warden's sitting there beside him, and he pulls out that badge and shows it to him. To the game warden's surprise, he lit another stick and handed it to him. He said, you going to sit there and complain, or you going to fish? So, well, he didn't really do it that way. And that was a long story for nothing, but it was a good place for me to put it. But my thought is, maybe we shouldn't ought to wait for God to drop some dynamite on us before we decide, I'm going to get involved and get in and see what I can do. You can't be involved in everything. You can't be a part of everything. I have been accused. I remember a lady that was here several years back. She says, she was trying to plan some things in the church, and of course, if you're going to plan things, I am going to have some say in it, and I'm going to check and make sure it's not against what the Bible would do. But she asked me one day, and she was a little bit upset. She said, do you have to be involved in everything that happens at the church? And I said, no, I don't, but I'm going to try to be involved as much as I can. I said, it's my church. And I said, I was involved as much as I could before I was pastor, and I said, I'm not going to try to be involved less now. But you can't do everything, but we need to be in. If we're going to avoid becoming the complacent person, we got to keep a focus on our place in God's Word. But that leads me to my second thing. We cannot lose sight of our purpose in this work. In verse 5, he's talking there. He talks about these men. He said, they're ministers by whom ye believed, even as the Lord gave to every man. I'm thinking about our purpose. All of us can look back, and if you're saved, and you can look back to think of the reasons, who is involved in that? What encouraged you to want to come to Christ? Maybe it was this person, their testimony. Maybe it was the way this person treated you when you visited here. Maybe somebody come to your house. All these different things, and there's usually more than one person involved. But back in chapter number 1, Paul, I'm going to read chapter 1, verse 17. Paul says, for Christ sent me not to baptize. I'm talking about, don't forget your purpose. Paul said, I didn't come to baptize people. Did he baptize some? He might have, I don't know. But he said, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. So he said, my purpose was to get the gospel out. And we don't ever want to forget that, because Paul, he just wanted to be faithful in preaching what God gave him to preach. Because that's what people need. Sometimes we lose our focus in a church. And here, I'll give you some examples. Down through the years, there's been people, and there may still be some. For instance, you're in the choir. Well, we need people singing in the choir. That's good. But if the choir's not singing, we still need you to be here. But, there are people that if the choir's not singing, then that's all I do, so I'll just go somewhere else and do something else. And we've had some that in the orchestra. The orchestra is important. We don't have a lot of folks in it right now, but if the orchestra wasn't playing, or if something, that was the only thing that was important, was orchestra. If you work in junior church, that's important. I think it's very important. But if we're not having junior church, last Sunday we had everybody in here, so is it not important? So I do something else, and that's what happens. We forget our purpose. Our purpose is to get the gospel to people. And that's why Faith Baptist Church exists, so that we can help people to know Christ. And so we're here because there's people in our community that need to hear the gospel. So just because we get so involved in part of our ministry that we forget the goal of it is to reach people for Christ. And so we have to be careful of that. A complacent Christian loses sight of that. And I can almost guarantee you this Corinthian church wasn't winning people to the Lord. Wasn't people coming down to the altar. Wasn't people getting saved. Wasn't nobody going visiting any houses or anything, because they were more concerned about who was more important. Was it Paul? Was it Apollos? Was it Peter? Then there was a real spiritualist who said, no, I'm just of Christ. And so they was thinking about who was the most talented. And if we're going to avoid this pitfall of complacency, don't lose sight of our place, and don't lose sight of the purpose while we're here. It's to reach people. And you may have to step outside of your normal bounds and do some things. And then the third thing we don't want to lose sight of is our prize in God's work. In verse 6 there, he talked about how he planted and Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. But then he says in verse 7, so then neither is he that planteth anything, neither he that watereth, but God that giveth the increase. So it's not the preacher that's involved, that's responsible for everything. It's not the worker. They're involved, but it's not them. It's God that brings the increase, and it's God that deserves the glory. Verse 8, he says, now he that planteth and he that watereth are one. Was it? We work together. There's unity. Nobody's more important than anybody else. Nobody is, well, you know, I do this, and so this is more important than, no, you may be different in the way you do something than somebody else, but that doesn't make it any more important. And so we all work together. We understand our place. We understand our purpose, and there's unity, and then God can get some things done. And the last part of verse 8 says, and every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor. Now, again, he's trying to encourage the Corinthians and us that God rewards according to your labor. Now, think about this. There's probably some things that you do that people never know. Does it bother you? I remember, still when I was very young, in our old building, the very first building we have, it was very small. I mean, it's much smaller than just probably this center section here. And I remember a family in our church, we had a wood stove in those days. And I remember when we took it out, and when they took it out, they patched a hole in the ceiling. But you know, no one said anything about that on the next Sunday. And there was a family, oh man, I mean, I was just a kid, and I didn't understand why people was upset. Because I was glad it got patched myself. I didn't want but I didn't understand why they didn't get recognition. And that is a shame. And so we have to understand that if you do something for the Lord, you may not get recognized here, but God's not going to forget it. He doesn't miss things like you and I might miss things. But I like the way he rewards. It's not the basis on our success. He doesn't reward us because, okay, you reached 5 people for the Lord this year, or you reached 7 people, and he doesn't say that. He doesn't reward us on the basis of our results. He rewards us on the basis of our labor, what we do. And I think that's pretty important because it's God that gives the increase. So if it's my job, for instance, my job is to preach the gospel and get the word of God out. There's people I know that come to services and I know they're not saved, and I like to go back there and just hey, let's sit down until you get saved, but that's not my job. My job is to give them the truth. It's God's job to work on their hearts and be available anytime I can to help them. And so it's sort of like missionaries, and I think about this sometimes. If we have a missionary, and we've got some that was been out there since the 80s, and we're still supporting them, but let's say we had someone go out and they work as a missionary for years, and only a handful of people get saved. And I can name you some very good missionaries that's happened to. But another one goes out and they work for a few years and they have tremendous results. And a lot of folks get saved and they start 2 or 3 different churches. Here's what we do. We have a tendency to do. We look at the one and say, boy, the God is really blessing him. He's doing the business. I wonder what's wrong with old Bill over here. His ministry is not doing so good. And because we're judging it by what results and what seems like success, but that's not the way God judges. Now, it's one thing if he's lazy and he's not doing what he ought to be doing, and that's why nothing's happened. We did have a missionary that we took on a few years back. He was in Alaska, and I couldn't get any updates from him what he was doing. He never sent letters. He never sent messages. So I got a hold of his home church. I couldn't even get them to answer. It was out of New York, and I couldn't get any information from them. And I tried for several months, and finally I got a hold of another missionary in Alaska, and he said, yeah, I know the gentleman. He said, he belongs to a church, but he's just a member of that church. He works a job. He wasn't being a missionary. He wasn't doing anything. So we dropped him. I couldn't get him to answer me anyhow, so I figured he wasn't needing that. But that was a different story. But if a person's been out there and they've been faithful and they've been preaching and they've been doing what God's called them to do, God sees them as a success. And he rewards them that way, according to their labor, not according to how many people got saved. And in fact, he might have been more successful than the one who looked like he had success. And I'll give you an example. In the Old Testament, there's a prophet named Jeremiah. You can read the book of Jeremiah and he was one of the most dedicated prophets that God had. And God called him to proclaim a message of judgment. Not the kind of message you want to preach all the time. I mean, some people like to preach mean stuff all the time, but not something. But he had a message of judgment. Because of that, he was ridiculed. He was persecuted. He was rejected. He was scorned. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they threw him in a well. I might have the wrong preacher there. It just hit me in my mind that they threw him in a well. But in contrast to Jeremiah, think about Jonah. Now, Jonah is one of the most famous backsliders in the Bible. God said, Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh. He said, I don't like them people, and I don't like that place, so I'm getting in this ship, and I'm going down to Tarshish because that's a long ways from where and so his attitude was, I'm going to do my thing my way, and I'm not going to submit to God. That was a prophet. Believe it or not, preachers can get there sometimes. And so what God do? Well, God had to discipline him, and God delivered him to Nineveh himself by way of well express, I guess you could say. And he got him to do what he wanted him to do, but it was a little tougher on him. And as Jonah gets to Nineveh and he preaches, he still doesn't like it. The whole city repents and follows the Lord. So what's Jonah do after that? He gets mad. He gets mad because God didn't destroy him and didn't do anything. But can you see the contrast here? On one hand, you have a man who gave his whole heart, his life, his soul. And if you'd ask people around him in his day, he didn't have much results. Jeremiah didn't. He didn't accomplish much. He was kind of a failure. But if you ask him about Jonah, said, man, he did the business. He was a man who got the results. Truth is, I would say Jeremiah got a lot more rewards when he stood before God than what Jonah got. So how do you explain it? God gives the increase. God got what he wanted done, and he accomplished that. So God's the one that knows your heart, and God's the one that he knows your labor. He knows your work. My thought is, don't forget our prize in the work. God will accurately judge the quality of what we do and why we do it. And our desire should just be, I want to be faithful to the Lord. I want to do what he called me to do, and I'd like to someday hear that, well done. I really think there's going to be several people that get to hear that, and it'd be a great thing. How wonderful that would be. So I hope that would be the longing of your heart. One last thing, and I'm looking at that clock. I thought it already said 8 o'clock, and I thought, man, I really went after it. But I think now it says 7:35, so I think we're going to have to do something else, some exercises or something. But don't forget our power in God's work. Look with me again in chapter 3 and verse 9 and 10. It says, for we are laborers together with God. Ye are God's husbandry, you're God's building. According to the grace of God, which is given unto me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereon. I'm thinking about our ability, our power in God's work. Down through the years, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say to me and to other preachers, I can't do this or that. I can't do such and such. Now, there are some things you cannot do. If you ask me to go out there and change an engine in a bus, I can't do that. If you ask me to build some things, I probably can't do that. But there's a lot of things what we really mean is I won't. There's things that we know that God would have us do, and there's opportunities, but our thought is I just won't. Now, probably the most famous I can'ter in the Bible is Moses. You remember God come and told him that I want you to go back to Egypt, I want you to get my people, and he started making excuses. I can't this, I can't that, I can't talk, I can't go. He went through everything, and we need to understand God will never ask you to do anything that you cannot do through his power. Now, he'll ask you to do a lot of things you can't do on your own. I've testified this many times, that the last thing in the world I could ever do when I was in school was stand up in front of people and talk. And I never did it. I refused to do it. I knew I could get good enough grades and everything else and take an F on that part of it and still get through the class. And I did it. I never stood in front of people, never gave a speech, never did any of that. And I just knew that I was never going to have to do that. And that changed. But maybe I should have learned it while I was in school. But we need to understand that God can enable you. If he calls you to do something, he'll give you what you need to do it. And you say, I just cannot talk to people about the Lord. Who can? Nobody. But since he tells us to, I'll guarantee you, if you try it, it'll work. You may not be the best at it. You may not say if you're like me, when I get done talking to someone on the way home, I can think of 20 things I should have said, but I didn't say them. I didn't think of them at the time. And I've probably told you this story, but I talked to a man. He's in Florida now. In fact, he's probably still listening to this right now on YouTube. But I went to his house, and he told me he wasn't sure if he was saved or not. And so we talked a little bit, and I think I've told this story, but you need to know it anyhow, in case you didn't hear it. But he told me he wasn't sure he was saved, and then we talked a little bit, and he told me how he had prayed, and he'd done these different things. And instead of me explaining to him how to be saved, and instead of me taking his word for it that he didn't feel like he was saved, I took from what he said, and I convinced him that he probably was saved. And then we prayed, and I went home, or I started home. And I got about halfway home, and I thought, that's probably the dumbest thing I've ever done. This man's not sure he's saved, and I stood there, instead of telling him how to get saved, I convinced him that he probably was saved. Could I tell you, if somebody's not sure they're saved, it doesn't hurt if they pray and ask the Lord to save them again. It's not like God's going to reach down there and crack you in the head and say, no, you already did that. He won't do that. And so I just turned around and I went back to his house. And I knocked on his door and I said, you know, I feel real uncomfortable about what I just did. I said, I talked to you, and he said, that's good, because he said, I kind of still feel uncomfortable about it too. So we went in and he prayed and he asked the Lord to save him. And then he got baptized, and later they moved to Florida, and they send me messages all the time. We're still listening to your sermons, so my thought is God can give you what it needs. You may not think you can talk to people, and you'll probably say a lot of the wrong things, but still, he gives us what we need to reach people so others can know him. And as I read through these verses, Paul is always giving God the glory. He's the one that gives the increase. And in verse 9, he reminds us that we're laborers together. So my thought is, if we're laborers, let's not work against him, let's work with him. But then in verse 10, he calls himself a master builder. He said, but what I do is according to the grace of God. God gives us the grace to sustain us so we can do those things that we always want to say, I can't. We can't do them on our own, but God, by his grace, he'll do that. So instead of us saying, I can't do this, or instead of us saying, I won't do this, what we ought to be saying is, by the grace of God, I'm going to do this. I'm going to step in there and do this. Now, not everything. If you absolutely cannot sing a note without being about six notes off key, maybe God's not telling you to sing a song. Don't just think, well, I'm going to do it. So not everything, but my thought is, if God tells you to do something, and some things we know obvious from the Word of God he's told us to do, just say, by the grace of God, I'm going to do it. It's going to be difficult, and I'm probably going to make a mess of it a couple times, but I'm going to get in there and do it. So complacency, as I mentioned a while ago, it's got a cousin named apathy. When you get to the place where it says, who cares? A church cannot afford to fall into that place, that pitfall of not caring. We have to care for people because the price is too high. It's the cost of souls. It's the cost of people being saved. And if someone didn't care, those ones that was baptized this last week would have never got saved. But somebody cared. Somebody told them about the Lord. And so I'm glad for God's grace that it'll enable us to do what God wants us to do. And I would encourage you, if you find yourself starting to get satisfied, starting to get complacent, ask God to help you refocus your vision. We've got people to reach. We've got things to do, and it takes everybody. And we want to be in on the battle. So don't fall to the pitfall of complacency. Now, with all that said, it's not 8 o'clock. It's not even a quarter till. And we don't spend any time on the prayer list anymore, because I know my sermons are not that short, but it'll work out all right. I do appreciate all of you being here tonight. And come back Sunday. We're going to start some new directions, new things, and it's same ways. We're just still going to be preaching, just going to do things a little bit different. We're going to sing some songs Sunday that you've probably never sang. And when we get done, some of you will probably say, I hope we never do that again. But maybe we'll do them good. They're good songs, just whether or not we can get them. And believe it or not, Brian gave me a song that he wanted me to learn, and I've already learned it. And I left it at the house. I was going to give it to Brad so he would know it by Sunday. I put it on a thumb drive, and it's at the house, so he'll have to stop and get it. But I'm excited about Sunday. I hope you'll come and see what's going to happen. If we can break 289 on this Sunday, we'll be going to be doing nowhere to go but up, I guess, from that. So, but you're a good bunch of folks. If you got some time, let's do a little praying over our prayer list, and we'll see you on Sunday.